Many who frequent the internet may have heard of a series known as RWBY. To those who don't know, it's an anime-like show that utilizes 3D motion capture to animate the adventures of a young Ruby Rose who is training to be a slayer of monsters. In the show, a majority of the characters are based off of heroes from fairy tales, and it is those same tales that drive Ruby. You see, Ruby is a girl who always finds the good in people, as well as the situation she's in. Even in the darkest of circumstances, she finds one ray of hope, and she always strives for the happy ending that the fairy tales often had. But one must remember that the original tellings of fairy tales were far from the happy, Disneyized versions we grew up with. So, once again, we must remember that the tale of Ruby Rose may very well be a dark and dismal place, much like the original fairy tales. Imagine this, if you will. Everything, the entire show, is all a figment of Ruby's imagination. Ruby is actually just a normal little girl who lives in a bad household, and the only happiness she can find is in the adventures she makes up that are based off her favorite childhood stories. Her teammates, Yang, Xiaolong, Blake Belladonna, and Weiss Schnee are nothing more than dolls that Ruby played with while growing up. But each one was based off a real person in Ruby's life. You see, Yang was Ruby's actual sister, but sadly was killed as a child. This happened when Ruby was really young, so she didn't fully understand what happened. All that she knew was that her sister, the one person who always looked after her, simply went away and began to ignore her. Later, Ruby received a cute little doll with blonde, curly hair. So Ruby decided to name the doll Yang, after her deceased sister. And that doll would be a far better sister than the one who started ignoring her. Ruby grew very attached to the doll, and would never be seen without it. But this behavior angered Ruby's father, Tai Yang, so in hopes that it would help the situation, he got her a new doll. Only, this one had black hair and yellow eyes. Due to this doll being almost the opposite in appearance of Yang, Ruby decided that this new doll would be a shy and cautious girl, an exact opposite of Yang. In fact, the doll reminded her of a girl that she had met in daycare, named Blake. Ruby assumed that she was shy because she never talked to anyone during playtime, and she even stopped coming to daycare altogether one day. It was later revealed that the girl named Blake was killed, and what's even more bizarre is that it happened exactly 1 month after Yang's death. For a time, Ruby had lots of fun playing with her new friends, Yang and Blake. They would fight the scary creatures of Grimm, who were actually just animal toys that Ruby had. She called them Grimm due to her father saying that they looked grim. Most of the animal toys were old and dirty and scary anyway, so Ruby always made them the bad guys in her adventures. But then, not so long afterwards, she was given a large dollhouse and a new doll accompanying it. This doll had long, white, tied-back hair, and Ruby couldn't think of anyone who had white hair. But there was a girl who had very pale blonde hair. Her name was Elderweiss, and Ruby had been wanting to become friends with her, Ruby was even invited to Elder Weiss's 7th birthday party. But sadly, she was killed a week before the big day. Ruby had heard that she was killed by people called the White Fangs. Those people sounded like they should be like the evil grim animal monsters that she always fought. So she made the White Fangs be bad people who were also like the scary animals. And even though Ruby was sad to hear of Elder Weiss's death, she saw this doll as a new opportunity. She named the doll Weiss, and she became Ruby's new best friend. She always assumed that Weiss was rich, due to getting the big dollhouse with the addition of Weiss. It was also around this time that Ruby's father began to have financial trouble. When Ruby asked about it, her father was always saying that the white powder cost too much, and the people who sold it were just rolling in cash. So Ruby decided that Weiss must sell this dust stuff in order for her to become rich, and thus the Schnee Dust Company was born. Now with 3 friends, Ruby had many adventures, fighting the grim animals and stopping the bad White Fangs from hurting anyone. For a year, she was truly happy with her dolls. Until one day, Tai Yang brought something new home. Not a doll, and not a toy, but a woman. Tai Yang told Ruby that her name was Cinder, and she was going to live with them from now on. Cinder also brought along her own children, Emerald, Mercury, and Neo. Ruby didn't like them very much. She preferred her 3 dolls. Cinder's 3 kids often got into trouble, and Ruby would always be blamed for it. The only one Ruby could ever stand was the youngest, Neo. She didn't talk much and liked the toys that Ruby played with. She always wanted to play with Ruby's 3 special dolls, but Ruby never let her. Neo normally didn't mind, but whenever Emerald and Mercury came around, Neo became mean and went along with tormenting Ruby. And whenever Ruby would tell Cinder about it, Cinder wouldn't listen and would just brush her aside. One day, Cinder was fixing her hair when Ruby came to tell her that the other 3 kids were tormenting her. Due to this, Cinder got angry and hit Ruby with the curling iron, burning her. Ruby ran off, crying, and hid in her room, and came to the decision that Cinder must be some form of witch, and that her and her friends had to find a way to stop her. That was also the day when someone new came to the house. Cinder had invited a man named Roman. Now, Ruby's father wasn't home, so Ruby didn't come out of her room, but she could tell that he wasn't a good man. He always had a funny-looking cane and smelled of smoke and puke. Ruby decided that he was a bad guy like the White Fangs, and she had to stop him. In the following weeks, Roman came more and more often to Ruby's house, and every time he would come, Ruby would play with her 3 dolls, imagining that she was stopping the evil plans of Roman and Cinder. But one day, when Ruby returned from school, she found a truly horrible sight. Emerald, Mercury, and Neo had found where Ruby hid her special dolls, and Neo was playing with them. Ruby quickly ran and swiped them up, but the Yang doll was still in Neo's hands, and when Ruby asked for it, Neo held it out. Ruby saw that the Yang doll was broken. Ruby was taken aback for a moment, and when Neo tried to explain what happened, Ruby suddenly grabbed the doll, smacked her across the face, and bolted from the room. Ruby ran all the way down into the basement, sobbing the whole way. There she found her mother's old sewing kit, and began to repair the Yang doll. But the more she repaired the doll, the more sad she felt. Why had her sister, her real sister, gone away? Why had she begun ignoring her? As Ruby sat there crying, clutching her 3 dolls close to her, Ruby heard the faint sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. She was afraid that Cinder would be angry for her hitting Neo, but when she turned around, she saw Roman standing at the bottom of the stairs. "Why are you crying, Red?" he asked. Ruby replied that she was sad that her sister Yang had started ignoring her, and that she wanted her to stop, and she wanted her to come back. She wanted to see her real sister again. Roman simply smiled and said, "I know where she is, and she wants to see you too." Ruby was so overwhelmed with joy that she didn't even realize that she was walking with Roman straight into the woods, carrying her 3 dolls with her in the hopes of seeing her sister again. That night, a missing child's report was stated. Police, both local and federal, searched day and night to try to find young Ruby. They even combed the woods by her house and found no sign of her. After months and months of dead ends, cold leads, and new cases popping up, the Ruby Rose missing persons case was dropped and deemed a cold case. Authorities believed that she was a new victim in the large amount of missing and dead girls that had plagued the area for years. But then, soon after the case was deemed cold, a new string of murders began to surface. Only this time, the victims weren't little girls. Drug dealers, murderers, and rapists began to fill body bags. The media was completely baffled by this new string of murders, and the only thing that strung them together was the fact that a doll was discovered at the residence of every victim the day before they were discovered dead. Even when victims went to the police for protection, they were still dead the following morning. And soon everyone knew that once a doll appeared on your doorstep, the game was over. And any attempts to try to capture the killer ended with failure. After a month of death, more than 24 murders were committed, and 24 dolls were recovered from the scenes of the murders. But the one thing that baffled police was that out of all the dolls, there were only 3 separate kinds. All were shown to be female, but one had long blonde hair, other mid-length black hair, and the third's hair was so pale that it was nearly white. What also baffled police was that each doll were stuffed with scraps of paper that either read "Grim Monster" or "White Fang," thinking that the term White Fang could possibly be connected to a local street gang. One day, on a whim, a detective working the case began to search if the dolls were somehow connected to other murders, and what he discovered truly frightened him. Each doll exactly resembled a young girl who was a victim in the young girl killings. 3 little girls named Yang, Blake, and Elderweiss. That night, as the police began to investigate their new developments, a doll appeared in front of a new house. Yet this one was different from the others. This one was special. The following morning, police discovered the residence of Roman Torchwick in shambles. The front door was smashed in, windows were broken, and a fire had charred half of the house. The man himself, or rather, what was left of him, was discovered on the front lawn, The once green grass was covered with blood, and individual body parts were found strewn about. And sitting just outside the door sat a small, black and red haired doll, one that, although representing a child, resembled the only other figure on the lawn. For at the center of all the carnage lay a sleeping young girl who wore the biggest grin on her face, and her clothes were stained with blood that could only be described as red like roses.